But we'll begin with the issue of crime. The government launched its latest assault on the Liberals today, once again accusing them of being soft on crime. The Liberals have decided they won't support a bill that would impose mandatory sentences for drug crimes. The new measures would include a mandatory 6-month sentence for being found with as few as 6 marijuana plants. In a moment, I'll speak with Justice Minister Rob Nicholson, but first, here's a heated exchange on the issue from Question Period today.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives' war on drugs bill is not tough on crime, it's dumb on crime. Yeah. A young person with 6 pot plants would be treated the same way as a mob boss. Right. An 18-year-old who abuses Tylenol-3 just once could face a minimum of 2 years in prison. Estimates peg the real cost of this bill at over $200 million just for BC. Will the Conservatives finally reveal what the real costs are to the Canadian taxpayers, because they're the ones who are going to pay the bill?
The Honourable Minister of Justice. Order.
Mr. Speaker, you didn't hear from them why they supported the bill, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to tell this honourable member, I would hope that you would at least read the bill, Mr. Speaker. That bill deals with traffickers, every single paragraph. That is completely lost on the Leader of the Opposition. It's lost on this member, Mr. Speaker. The dumbest thing I've heard in this Parliament is the Liberal policy about fighting crime. That's what's dumb.
So, that's the kind of day it was in the House of Commons today. The fight over who's toughest on crime in Canada was front and centre. Let's follow up with Justice Minister Rob Nicholson. I spoke with him a little earlier this evening. Rob Nicholson, first of all, thanks for making time to speak with me this evening. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Why do you believe the country badly needs these mandatory minimum sentences for drug convictions? Why do you believe the current sentencing measures aren't doing the trick?
I've been told by law enforcement agencies and others across this country that the people who have taken over the drug industry are part of organized crime and illegal gangs in this country. And they tell me that we have to send the correct message out to those people who are bringing drugs into Canada, for instance, that there are serious consequences if you get involved with this kind of activity. We want to send out that message. So the bill addresses people who bring drugs into Canada, export drugs, people in the grow-op business for the purposes of trafficking, people who sell drugs around schools. We reclassified the date rape drugs. So it sends out the right message, and I think it's appropriate legislation, and this is why it has the widespread support. Charles Mummy from the Canadian Police Association was with me earlier today in support of this, so it has good support, and it should be passed.
Oh, okay. Who are the measures aimed at? Because that seems to be a bone of contention for your critics.
I was very careful on this bill that it targets traffickers, and so any suggestion that this goes after the poor individual who is unfortunately addicted, or the person who is experimenting, or the person who has 1 or 2 plants in the kitchen for his own purpose, that's not what who the bill is directed at. I've been very careful. It's directed at traffickers, and they tell me the people who run this business, again, are organized crime.
Yeah, okay, but your legislation says that the mandatory minimums would kick in for anyone caught with anything above 5 marijuana plants. They would be subject to 6 months in jail. So that your critics, they're saying that young people who aren't part of organized crimes, it could end up in jail for 6 months and in fact be made into hardened criminals for this youthful lapse of judgment of having 5 marijuana plants. What's your response to that?
First of all, it's between 6 and 200 marijuana plants, and if you check the section out, Peter, it very clearly says for the purpose of trafficking, and that's a question of fact on each case. So the individual who has had 150 plants and has cleaned out 144 of them, or rather 143, still has 6 or 7 plants. If they are in it for the purposes of trafficking, that's when this bill kicks in. I was very clear on that. I appreciate the critics.
Yeah, well, I want
the Liberals, they don't want to talk about that, but that's who we're after.
Well, let's be clear on that. So here's the question. So an individual with 6 plants, is he by definition in this bill a trafficker, and does a judge have any choice but to send him to jail for 6 months?
The judge has a choice. They have to prove that he is in the business of selling, distributing the drugs. That's the way the trafficking provisions now are in the criminal code, and that continues. It's a question of fact. So there's a difference between somebody who has some marijuana for their own consumption. That's still illegal. Yeah. But that's not what this bill is about. It goes after the people who are distributing and selling it.
So how many more people would end up in jail under this bill and these mandatory minimum sentences?
Again, I would hope very few. I would hope that people would get the message and say this is not the business to be in, particularly those people who bring drugs into Canada. I hope they have a look at this and say Canada is not the place to be bringing in drugs. You could end up in jail for 1, 2, 3 years just to begin with.
But for every legislative measure you take, in this case, one assumes that more people would end up in jail than are ending up in jail now on these provisions.
I'll tell you what I do.
Well,
I get my assurances from the Minister of Public Safety that the capacity will be there. That's part of the budgetary process, and I appreciate people are worried about costs of detaining a dangerous individual, but I always say there's a cost to victims as well when these people are out on the streets.
Well, let me put that to you another way. Does it matter to you that there is an increased cost in the correction system because of these measures, or are they just the right measures at any cost?
I agree that there is increased costs anytime you bring in new legislation, and I'm satisfied that we can meet those obligations, and this is why I'm in ongoing discussions with the Public Safety Minister, who gives me assurances that that capacity is there. And again, I concentrate on the costs to victims in this country.
Understood, but there is a series of costs involved with the various so-called the tough-on-crime legislation your government's bringing forward. And maybe you don't know all of them, but on this one, what is the additional cost on this one? I'm sure, I'm sure that must have formed part of the research that went into this bill.
Well, if you remember, when I announced the National Anti-Drug Strategy, we set aside for the purposes of enforcement of this bill $17 million. And so that's part of the process for people who don't want the bill. That won't make them happy. But,
well, that's the enforcement side, but what's the correction cost?
Again, my understanding from the correction sides, and the minister has put out his budgetary projections on that, and I'm satisfied with that.
Okay. You said this bill targets organized crime and major drug traffickers. So, but let's be clear about this. You're saying someone growing 6 plants doesn't qualify as a big-time marijuana trafficker necessarily.
Not necessarily. I mean, the bill targets traffickers because what they tell me is that for the most part, these marijuana grow-ops form part of the currency to bring drugs, harder drugs, into this country. They're all part of it. And I don't have to tell your listeners how dangerous it is to have these grow-ops in your neighborhood, what the health and safety concerns that people have justifiably for that. And if you're running one of those businesses or thinking of getting into that business, we're very clear on that. Don't do it, because there will be some serious consequences if you're in the for the purpose of trafficking.
Let me ask you about another quick issue today before I let you go. The issue of judicial appointments. Brian Abrams named a judge in Ontario's Superior Court of Justice last Friday. He was until 2 months ago the Conservative Party candidate in the riding of Kingston and the Islands.
Exactly.
How do you explain that appointment?
Everybody who becomes a judge in this country has to go through a process where their name is put before a committee. That committee is comprised of provincial representatives, law society, bar association, law enforcement, as well as federal appointments. They have a look at that. They make a call whether that person is qualified or unqualified. If a person is qualified and is appropriate candidate for the bench, they send that to my office. I've been very proud to be part of over 300 recommendations for judicial appointments. They've been well received in this country, Peter.
Right. So should someone's very recent and open political affiliation be considered when they are vetted for these appointments?
It shouldn't block anybody, the fact that somebody has been interested to serve in some other capacity in this country. I consider this service by members who are prepared to accept an appointment to the bench, and I think that this country can be very thankful for the individuals who sit on the bench in Canada.
But, I mean, when he was vetted, certainly his party affiliation and the fact that he was a Conservative Party candidate in Ontario would clearly have been known by the vetting committee.
I'm sure. I'm sure that that would have been apparent to them.
Okay, and when he resigned, when he quit the candidacy in December, he would have. Are you saying he would have had no idea he was going to be appointed a judge?
Again, I don't get into the process. A person's entitled to put their name forward. Those names get sent to my office if they are qualified, and then we try and get individuals who fit, the linguistic requirements. Try to get people into areas that will work for them as part of their life.
Ultimately, the appointment is yours.
Ultimately, that's correct.
And you know Brian Abrams. You knew full well he was a candidate in
no question. We get a complete dossier and the complete application of everyone.
All right, and the perception is, and again, you're being criticized for that today, that this is a patronage appointment of a party friend.
I say people put it in the context of the 300 people that we have put forward. We have promoted people to the bench who were appointed by previous Liberal governments. Again, I think any analysis of the over 300 judges that I have recommended will stand up to scrutiny.
Rob Nicholson, appreciate your time this evening.
My pleasure.